The Amazon, a vast, endless ocean of green, stretching farther than the eye can see, breathing mist into the morning sky. Beneath its canopy, rivers twist like living veins, carrying secrets through a land older than memory itself. For centuries, it has been called the lungs of the earth, a realm of mystery and danger, where sunlight filters through 1,000 shades of emerald, and where human footprints seem to vanish almost as soon as they are made. To early explorers, it was a wilderness untouched by civilization, a place too dense, too wet, too chaotic to sustain anything beyond small, scattered tribes. They called it the Green Desert, an environment hostile to agriculture, hostile to cities, hostile to history. But they were wrong. Beneath this living cathedral lies a different story, one carved not in stone, but in soil. In recent decades, scientists have begun to uncover signs that the forest hides more than trees. Beneath the roots and vines lie the faint outlines of forgotten geometry. Circles, causeways, ditches, and roads, vast patterns etched into the earth with mathematical precision. Hidden cities that predate European contact. Settlements that once supported tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. The forest, it seems, did not erase their existence, it protected it. Every fallen leaf, every layer of humus, became a shroud sealing away the memory of a civilization that once flourished here. A civilization that learned to live not against nature, but with it. This is not the story of explorers or conquerors. It is the story of people who turned one of Earth's most difficult landscapes into a garden, a society whose knowledge of ecology, soil, and sustainability rivals anything known today. As the canopy sways and the cicadas sing, we begin our journey into the heart of the Amazon and into the buried memory of the world's most secret civilization. For centuries, a story about the Amazon held like a shadow over every map and textbook. An immense, impenetrable green sea, beautiful, dangerous, and almost empty. The narrative was simple and seductive. Tropical soil, the argument went, was thin and quickly leached by rain. Rivers flooded and poisoned the land. Disease and predators made permanent settlements impossible. From this idea sprang an assumption that shaped science, policy, and imagination alike. Complex civilization needed stone, grain, and visible monuments. Where those things were absent, scholars assumed people were few and mobile, not builders, not urban, not worthy of the name civilization. That belief was not born in a vacuum. It arrived wrapped in the authority of Enlightenment naturalists and colonial administrators, reinforced by 19th century explorers whose journals read like cautionary tales. They arrived with machetes, muskets, and European frameworks for what counted as advanced. When they saw a forest where they expected plazas and temples, they assumed failure. Either the environment was incapable of sustaining people, or the people who lived there were necessarily simple. This was a failure of imagination as much as of evidence. The tools of Western archaeology, stone architecture, monumental sculpture, libraries of inscriptions, were the wrong instruments for a landscape built of wood, soil, and living memory. The myth hardened into orthodoxy. For decades, textbooks taught that the Amazon was a pristine wilderness, a green desert with sparse human presence. That notion fit neat narratives about Europeans discovering wilderness and rendered invisible the long human histories that had shaped those forests. Yet even in the 19th and early 20th centuries, hints accumulated that the story was incomplete. Travelers recorded anomalous clearings, buried pottery shards, and oral tales of great settlements. These fragments were dismissed as curiosities or folklore, curios to be filed under romance rather than history. The weight of the argument for emptiness was cultural as well as empirical.
The absence of stone monuments had been mistaken for the absence of civilization itself. Enter the explorers whose names populate the popular imagination. Men like Percy Fawcett, who spent decades convinced that a grand city, which he called Z, slumbered somewhere in the forest. Fawcett's story occupies the borderland between myth and method. He was part adventurer, part military cartographer, and part chronicler of colonial prejudice. His disappearance in 1925 enshrined the romantic possibility that a lost, complex world might indeed lie beneath the canopy. But more important than the drama of his fate was the fact that later careful archaeology would vindicate pieces of what he had intuited. Complex, organized societies did exist in the Amazon, though not in the exact forms of hyperbolic legend. The narratives of myth and loss turned out to be clues, not mere fantasy. The intellectual turning point came slowly and from multiple directions. Beginning in the mid-20th century, anthropologists and archaeologists started paying closer attention to the region's small signs, pottery fragments, post-hole stains, the shapes of earthworks barely visible beneath leaf litter. Then, as the late 20th century gave way to the 21st century, technologies and methods matured in ways that transformed possibility into proof. Satellite imagery picked out straight lines and rings where once only jungle had been seen. Systematic surveys recorded networks of ditches, causeways, and plazas in places like Acre and the upper Tapajós. Where traditional field archaeology had been blind, the forest's own footprint, soil patterns, carbon signatures, and hydrological modifications began to speak. The result was a slow demolition of the old myth. The Amazon was not a blank slate. It was a palimpsest written in soil and water.
One of the most striking pieces of evidence came not from walls, but from earth itself. Terra preta, the dark, humus-rich soils that dot the basin. For scientists, the existence of these soils was a problem that demanded explanation. In a landscape of nutrient-poor oxysols, sparkling with the chemical poverty typical of tropical forests, these dark patches were lush, enduring, and indisputably human-made. They are rich in charcoal, pottery shards, bone, and organic matter, signs of long, intentional accumulation. Modern analysis shows that terra preta can sustain intensive agriculture for centuries without the frequent following that other tropical soils require. In short, it is evidence of large-scale, sustained cultivation and landscape management, an ecological technology that would allow dense populations to flourish. The presence of this engineered soil changed the terms of the debate. People in the Amazon had not merely survived, they had redesigned the soil to make the forest more productive. Archaeologists also began to catalog geometric earthworks, rings, plazas, and straight causeways across regions of the western and southern Amazon. In Acre, researchers documented hundreds of geoglyphos, large geometric earthworks visible when soil and vegetation are disturbed, some dating back millennia. In the upper Tapajós and Xingu basins, surveys uncovered networks of villages connected by roads, causeways, and canals. Plazas and defensive ditches appear again and again in patterns that indicate planning and social coordination on scales previously unimagined for the region. These were not isolated farmsteads, but integrated landscapes, clusters of settlements, ceremonial centers, and engineered fields that formed regional systems. The architecture was not stone and marble, but earth, wood, and water, materials that made their civilizations excellent at living in a rainforest, but left them invisible to observers looking for carved stone. The modern revolution in perception has a technological face: LiDAR and high-resolution remote sensing. When scientists began sweeping sections of the Amazon with airborne LiDAR, the canopy ceased to be an impenetrable curtain. Laser pulses measured tiny differences in elevation beneath vegetation and revealed straight roads, plazas, reservoirs, and moats with eerie clarity. A landmark study of low-density urbanism in the Bolivian Amazon
used LiDAR to map settlement patterns, showing networks of plazas, earthworks, and water management systems consistent with organized, long-term occupation across large regions. These discoveries didn't merely point to the presence of people, they revealed the scale and sophistication of the ways those people shaped the landscape. The impression of emptiness, produced by colonial narratives and methodological blind spots, began to crack under the weight of direct measurement. None of this undoes the realities of the past. Amazonian cities did not look like Rome or Teotihuacan. They were not cemented by the same visible monuments that historians often use as the shorthand of complexity. Their strength lay in subtlety, hydrological engineering that turned seasonal flooding into advantage, soil technologies that stored fertility, and social systems that coordinated labor across vast distances. Because they chose wood, earth, and living systems over stone, their traces are fragile. In some places, centuries of forest growth conceal mounds that once hosted plazas. In others, rivers have shifted and taken entire neighborhoods with them. But fragility does not equal insignificance. Indeed, the human hand is evident everywhere if one learns to read a different script. The curvature of a ditch, the distribution of dark soil, a straight causeway pointing through an otherwise random forest. The myth's persistence also owed something to disaster, one not of nature, but of history. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, the greatest weapon they carried was invisible: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed. Scholars now estimate that in some regions, populations collapsed by as much as 80 to 90% within a century of contact. Such demographic cataclysm would have shattered social structures, interrupted agricultural maintenance, and allowed forest growth to erase the most obvious traces of habitation. In other words, ecological recovery was a second erasure layered on top of the first. After people were wiped out, the forest quietly reclaimed plazas and roads, turning living memory into silence. This silence made the 19th century assumption of emptiness tragically easy to believe. What we are left with then is a new and harder question. How should we redefine civilization when the markers of complexity are not marble and languages inscribed in stone, but soil chemistry, engineered waterways, and living memory? The answer requires a change in both instruments and imagination. It requires listening to modern indigenous narratives, integrating ethnography with remote sensing, and reading the landscape with an eye attuned to subtle human signatures. Above all, it demands humility. The Amazon's history was not a void to be filled by outsider stories. It was a lived, engineered world whose disappearance from the record had more to do with disease, bias, and method than with any absence of human genius. In the next sections of our journey, we will trace how the clues assembled across a century of work, field survey, soil chemistry, remote sensing, and oral history, combined into a coherent picture. We will follow the rivers and roads between villages that once hummed with life. We will learn the techniques that created terra preta and sustained dense populations. And we will meet the people whose descendants still carry memory in song and story. For now, we can say this: the myth of an empty Amazon was not a neutral mistake. It was a story that obscured human achievement. The forest did not hide a lack of history. It concealed history itself, patiently waiting for us to learn how to read its silence.
They called it El Dorado in the language of European longing, a city of gold, a place that could rewrite maps overnight. Stories of shimmering plazas and gilded temples moved through salons in Madrid and London like fever. For centuries, those tales mixed myth and memory, exaggerated merchant reports, misread indigenous accounts, and the hungry imaginations of men who wanted empire and treasure. But buried in the folklore was a different kind of truth. Scattered hints that somewhere under the green, a human world of surprising scale had once existed.
The echo of that world would reverberate through explorers' journals, the fragmentary reports of missionaries, and the fantasies of men who would risk everything to find it. Percy Fawcett is the figure who best embodies this uneasy border between adventure and archaeology. A British surveyor with a soldier's discipline and a cartographer's curiosity, Fawcett spent decades tracing rivers and trading routes through the Mato Grosso. He carried maps like talismans and a stubborn conviction that the Amazon hid cities, not in the monumental stone of the Old World, but in forms that his contemporaries refused to recognize. In his private notes, he named the idea Z, a shorthand for an ordered world lost to time. He vanished in 1925 while pursuing that conviction. His disappearance became itself a myth, a dramatic punctuation that obscured what his journeys suggested. The Amazon had been home to complex sedentary societies, and the forest's silence was not proof of emptiness, but of concealment. Before the age of radar and satellite, the forest could swallow anything: roads, plazas, entire neighborhoods, until they were only depressions and humus in the soil. Still, explorers and missionaries left traces. In the 16th century, accounts from early Spanish chroniclers mention populous river towns and cultivated fields along great waterways. Gaspar de Carvajal wrote with astonishment about densely settled stretches of the Amazon in the wake of Francisco de Orellana's voyage. Those testimonies, transmitted through centuries, collided with later scientific dogma that declared the basin unable to support sustained agriculture. For too long, this collision settled in favor of the dogma. Early European observations were treated as anomalies, misinterpretations, or outright invention. Only later would the fragments be reassembled into a coherent picture. The 19th and early 20th centuries produced a peculiar map of ignorance. Naturalists arriving with linear categories, geologists studying soils, and colonial botanists all confirmed a puzzling pattern. The Amazon's oxysols were poor in the nutrients that European agronomy prized. Rivers carried silt, but not the kind that made fertile floodplains in the Nile or the Mississippi. Tropical rain leached minerals quickly. From these facts flowed the conclusion that permanent, high-density settlement was unlikely. This was more than a scientific judgment. It was an interpretive framework that shaped what investigators looked for. If civilization meant carved stone and monumental architecture, then the Amazon would not and could not be a place of empires. And yet, whispers persisted. In forests and along rivers, travelers found pottery shards, post holes, and sometimes human-modified soils, dark patches that appeared oddly fertile compared to the surrounding red clay. These anomalies were intriguing but isolated. The tragic collapse of indigenous populations after European contact, driven by diseases unknown to native immune systems, amplified the pattern of disappearance. Centuries of population decline allowed wood and fiber structures to rot, leaving little visible evidence for those who came later. The forest did not so much erase as conspire with time. When social infrastructures faltered and fields were abandoned, canopy and root systems moved quickly to reclaim anything built of perishable materials. The result was a double erasure, first of people, then their works. In public imagination, Fawcett and the lure of El Dorado overlapped and blurred with these scientific lacuna. His journals, full of mapped tracks, ethnographic notes, and fervent speculation, read as both serious fieldwork and the fevered dream of a man seduced by a legend. Fawcett's thinking drew on existing clues, reports like Manuscript 512, held in Brazilian archives, and stories he heard from indigenous informants, pointing toward large villages and complex irrigation systems. He was not a scientist in the modern sense, but his insistence that something lay beneath the canopy pushed subsequent researchers to look more closely, and to ask different questions about what counted as evidence. The drama of Fawcett's disappearance cemented his idea into myth, yet beneath the myth there remained an inconvenient fact. Multiple lines of evidence would, decades later, corroborate pieces of his hunch. The mid-20th century marked a quiet shift. Anthropologists working with indigenous communities began to record oral traditions that preserved memories of larger ancestral settlements, networks of trade, and engineered fields. Ethnographers heard songs about great plazas and stories of communal labor that sounded, in the right reading, like social memory of densely organized towns. Simultaneously, archaeologists on the ground started to find material correlates, pottery distributions indicating concentrated habitation, linear ditches that outlined plazas, and charcoal lenses in the soil that suggested controlled burning and organic enrichment. Each discovery alone could be dismissed as local. Taken together, they created a pattern that demanded explanation. The decisive turn came with the marriage of new technology and renewed fieldwork. In regions such as Acre, researchers unearthed geometric earthworks, the so-called geoglyphs, rings and enclosures visible when the forest or soil is disturbed. These were not random clearings. They were planned shapes, often accompanied by roads and sometimes by causeways connecting one enclosure to another. Carbon-14 dating placed many of these structures across a broad time span, showing sustained human presence entering deep into pre-Columbian times. The geoglyphs suggested regional coordination, communal efforts to modify landscapes on scales that implied organized labor, shared cosmologies, and political organization beyond the household. In effect, the soil and the geometry it preserved began to speak back. Then, in the late 20th century and early 21st century, remote sensing became a revelation. High-resolution satellite imagery and later airborne LiDAR allowed scientists to perceive the subtle topography beneath the canopy everywhere. Roadways rose in straight lines, plazas emerged as flat, ordered spaces, and networks of ditches and canals came into focus. LiDAR, in particular, was transformative because it could remove the visual noise of leaves and branches and render the microtopography that human engineering leaves behind. Studies in the Bolivian Amazon, for example, revealed low-density urbanism, clusters of settlements with plazas, roadways, and water control features extending across broad landscapes. These were not isolated hamlets, they were parts of integrated systems. The forest, for all its power to reclaim, had left an unmistakable human signature, readable by instruments that finally matched the scale of the archive.
But what did these discoveries mean for the images of empire and city that Western scholarship used as its models? They demanded a conceptual shift. Amazonian urbanism was not the density of Tenochtitlan or the stone cities of the Andes. It was a different urbanism, low density but extensive, relational rather than centralized, adaptive rather than monumental. Urban centers here were garden cities, populations embedded in networks of agroforestry, fishery management, and engineered soils. Their infrastructure capitalized on what the forest offered. Seasonal floods were managed rather than fought. Biodiversity was a resource to cultivate in place of monoculture. Wood and earth were the primary building materials. In short, Amazonian societies created architectures of life rather than lasting stone monuments, and their success depended on systems that fit a humid, dynamic ecology rather than the dry permanence of marble and basalt. The rediscovery of these patterns also forced historians and archaeologists to reconsider the meaning of collapse and continuity. When European diseases depopulated regions, the intensive management practices that kept soils fertile and waterways controlled would have been abandoned. Without human tending, the forest's succession accelerated, and infrastructural features, roads, raised fields, wooden platforms, fell into disrepair. Rivers shifted course, canals silted up, Plazas became hummocks. The ecological footprint of human life persisted invisibly as terra preta and subtle morphological changes in the landscape, but the social systems that once animated them were gone. To understand the past, therefore, one must read the traces not simply as ruins, but as palimpsests, layers of human ingenuity written into soils and hydrology, then reinscribed by the forest after demographic collapse. And yet the story is not only of disappearance, it is also a story of survival in the most human sense. Cultural memory carried forward by living peoples. Many Amazonian indigenous groups preserve traditions, songs, and oral histories that reference large ancestral villages, migration stories, and practices of soil enrichment. Ethnographic research shows continuity in cultivation techniques and social institutions that, when read with archaeological evidence, imply long threads of knowledge transmission. These are not mere echoes, they are living links between the people who now inhabit the basin and those who shaped its landscape centuries ago. Respecting those links reframes discovery. Archaeology does not unearth a lost people so much as it provides tools for honoring the resilience of descendants who survived contact and carried their practices forward. The romance surrounding lost cities like Fawcett's Z remains compelling because it entertains a simple narrative, a hidden civilization waiting to be found. The reality is more complex and more human. The Amazon's past is neither treasure hunt drama nor a single great city. It is a mosaic of towns, ceremonial centers, engineered fields, and networks of exchange whose scale and sophistication rival other early complex societies when measured by appropriate metrics. These communities built systems tuned to a wet, biodiverse world, systems that modern science is only beginning to appreciate and learn from. The myth, then, did something useful. It kept asking questions that the available data could not yet answer. When the right tools arrived, those questions were answered not with gold, but with knowledge, the humus of history itself. When we listen to the echoes, the explorers' journals, the missionary accounts, the oral traditions, the geoglyphs, and the soils, a clear picture begins to emerge. It is a picture of ingenuity adapted to place, of social systems that coordinated labor across rivers and forests, of agricultural knowledge that created durability in otherwise fragile tropical soils. It is also a picture shaded by tragedy. Demographic collapse and cultural disruption erased visible monuments and left a silence that misled generations. Understanding this history requires humility and a new set of questions, questions that ask how people live well in complex ecosystems, not merely how they built permanent monuments. In answering them, we do more than complete the past. We recover a different model of human possibility, one where cities are gardens and survival is measured in stewardship rather than stone. The echoes of the lost cities are finally becoming intelligible because the methods have changed. The instruments now match the archive. But the work is ongoing and collaborative, a conversation between technology, field archaeology, and indigenous voices. As we continue to map roads under canopy and date charcoal in dark soils, we must also listen to the descendants living along the rivers, to the songs that encode memory, and to the forest itself, which keeps a record in its soil and water. Only then can the echoes be assembled into a story worthy of those who shaped the Amazon, a story of labor, of adaptation, and of a civilization that for a long while the world refused to imagine.
When you stand at the mouth of an Amazonian river and look inland, the forest seems monolithic, an endless, rolling carpet of green that swallows horizons and erases human patterns. But look closer, and the jungle begins to whisper. The clues are subtle, a straight line where none should be, a shallow depression forming a perfect circle, a raised bed that runs like an obvious seam through otherwise random ground. Over the last half-century, those whispers have become a language. Field archaeology, remote sensing, and patient excavation have translated the forest's scripts into human stories. Roadways worn flat by repeated feet, plazas shaped for assemblies, defensive ditches, and an infrastructure of canals and causeways that knits villages into regions. This is where the forest stops being a curtain and starts being a palimpsest. The transformation began slowly, with field teams walking transects and opening test pits. Early archaeologists learned to read what the canopy concealed by paying attention to soil color, pottery scatter, and post-hole patterns. A shard of decorated pottery in a clearing is not merely an object, it is a coordinate in a human network. A charcoal lens in dark earth means long-term fire use, which often correlates with food processing or land management. In places where curious lines of trees trace a map, researchers found raised banks that, when excavated, revealed engineered layering, organic matter, charcoal, broken ceramics, evidence of deliberate soil improvement. Each small discovery pushed back against the old assumption that the Amazon could only sustain scattered nomadic bands. Then came large-scale surveys. Teams began to walk systematically, mapping the distribution of artifacts and microtopography. As these datasets grew, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Ringed enclosures, sometimes circular, sometimes geometric, showed up across wide areas. Causeways ran straight across wet ground, raised above seasonal floods. Plazas and connected village clusters repeated in landscape after landscape. In the Bolivian lowlands and the southwestern Brazilian frontier, archaeologists documented networks of settlements with interlocking rings and straight avenues. These were not accidental arrangements, they were designs, the product of collective planning. Part of the revelation came from the ground, part from above. When satellites started to deliver ever higher resolution images, analysts began to notice contrasts in vegetation and soil reflectance that hinted at anthropogenic change. Fields and forest had different signatures. Abandoned garden patches sometimes supported distinct tree species because people had planted or encouraged them. But the revolution was airborne LiDAR. Laser pulses from aircraft descended through leaves and returned minute measurements of the ground surface. Overnight, the canopy stopped obscuring microtopography. Where decades of machete work would have found only a few mounds, LiDAR revealed entire systems of roads, terraces, and reservoirs, traced with the kind of precision that used to be reserved for dry, stone-built landscapes. What LiDAR and intensive survey combined to show was not a single city, but a different urban logic. Where Western eyes had looked for concentric walls and temple pyramids, the Amazonian imprint showed plazas surrounded by domestic mounds, arranged along roads and waterways. These plazas were often large, flat, and deliberately leveled, appropriate for gatherings, markets, rituals, or judicial functions. Surrounding them were circular or rectangular household mounds where palisaded structures might have stood. Between settlements, raised causeways allowed movement during high water. Canals and fish weirs altered hydrology for food production. Reservoirs collected water for dry seasons. This is a picture of settlement systems adapted to a seasonal, dynamic ecology, a networked landscape rather than a single monumental core. The geometry matters because geometry implies intention. Straight causeways and long, linear terraces are not the result of chance. They require planning, coordination, and labor. The existence of these features indicates organized leadership or social institutions capable of mobilizing and directing work at scale. Equally important is the evidence of engineered soils in proximity to these sites. Dark, char-enriched earth appears in and around many of the settlement clusters, soil that retains nutrients and supports sustained cultivation. In combination with the physical layout of plazas and roads, the engineered soil makes a strong case for dense, long-term habitation supported by systematic agriculture. Surface finds amplified the argument. Concentrations of pottery, often decorated and stylistically consistent across multiple sites, indicate shared cultural frameworks and trade. Midden deposits, full of shell, bone, and plant remains, speak to diets organized around managed fisheries, gardens, and agroforestry. In some regions, archaeologists uncovered wood-lined fish traps, canals with sluices, and terrace walls that demonstrate sophisticated hydrological engineering.
These are technologies tailored to a rain-fed, flood-prone world. Rather than fight water, people shaped it, turning the river's cycles into predictable resources. Excavations deepened the story. Test trenches cut across plazas reveal stratified deposits, layers of occupation separated by dark humus, and sometimes abrupt abandonment horizons. Carbon-14 dates from charcoal lenses in organic remains anchor these sites in time. Many show long sequences of occupation spanning centuries or even millennia. Such temporal depth argues against episodic or ephemeral use. It instead points to persistent centers, places where generations lived, worked, and remembered. The archaeology paints a distributed urbanism. Many medium-sized centers linked by roads and rivers, each with specialized functions, each part of a broader political economy. The distribution of these features is also telling. Geoglyphs and enclosures cluster in certain ecotonal zones where riverine and terra firma landscapes meet, places where seasonal flooding created both challenges and opportunities. Where the landscape offered a mix of upland and floodplain, people engineered niches, raised fields on floodplains, orchards on slightly higher ground, and canals where fish populations could be managed. The diversity of strategies suggests that Amazonian communities possessed detailed ecological knowledge and adaptive flexibility. They were not constrained by a single agricultural template. They diversified production across microenvironments, reducing risk and supporting higher population densities. Field teams also found material traces of exchange extending beyond local neighborhoods. Obsidian and other non-local lithics, specialized pottery styles, and stylistic affinities in ritual objects point to networks of trade and shared ritual calendars. Roads and navigable waterways would have made long-distance exchange practical, knitting distant plazas into political and economic systems. In some regions, archaeologists documented patterned arrays of mounds that align astronomically or mark landscape features, indicating ceremonial practices that integrated cosmology with settlement layout. The result is a picture of societies that were neither isolated nor anarchic, but embedded in a matrix of exchange, ritual, and governance. One of the most evocative classes of evidence is the straight causeway. Imagine a raised, stone-free road cutting a flawless line through trees and swamps, a deliberate connector. Causeways often link plazas, cross rivers via raised embankments, and run directly toward other known centers. Their presence suggests planned connectivity, corridors for traders, ritual processions, or administrative movement. Causeways are particularly interesting because they testified to an understanding of hydrology and construction techniques, built high enough to remain passable during inundation, composed of layered soils and sometimes reinforced with palisades or stone. These structures bespeak a capacity to plan at a landscape scale. Even where architecture was primarily perishable, wood, thatch, or palm, the imprint remained in negative space. Post holes, compacted floor layers, and patterned refuse deposits outline household plans. In some excavations, archaeologists recovered wooden beam slots and evidence for multi-room dwellings, suggesting more complex household layouts than previously assumed. The domestic scale, when multiplied across plazas and neighborhoods, magnifies into regional demographic heft. Far from being sparsely populated, these landscapes could plausibly support large populations living in interconnected village clusters.
Crucially, the archaeological picture is not monolithic across the Amazon. The basin is vast and ecologically diverse. Cultural strategies varied. In some places, the record favors intensive agroforestry and managed orchards. In others, canals and fishery systems dominate. This variability is itself informative. It indicates adaptive cultural diversity rather than a single homogeneous urban template. That diversity complicates attempts to produce a single narrative, but enriches the image, a mosaic of human strategies tuned to local ecologies, yet linked by trade, ritual, and social ties. The interpretive work that follows the discovery of such features is delicate.
Archaeologists must avoid imposing old-world categories, city, state, empire, when the evidence suggests different organizational logics. Instead, scholars have developed comparative frameworks that emphasize networks, resilience, and low-density urbanism. These concepts capture the reality that Amazonian societies were spatially extensive, politically sophisticated, and ecologically integrated, even if their material culture did not monumentalize power in ways familiar to Eurocentric models. Fieldwork also began to incorporate indigenous knowledge as a key interpretive lens. Oral histories, place names, and living practices provide context for the ruins, why a road runs where it does, which tree species were planted to mark paths, or how ritual calendars oriented to flood cycles. Ethnoarchaeology, the study of contemporary practices to inform the past, has been particularly fruitful. When archaeologists document orchards of useful tree species around an abandoned plaza, ethnographers can often point to living traditions of forest gardening that preserve techniques of soil enrichment and polyculture management. These living practices help explain how large populations could have been sustained without reliance on monoculture or unvegetated fields. The cumulative result of these methods, ground survey, excavation, remote sensing, and ethnography, is a pattern of organized, resilient occupation across the Amazon. This pattern reframes the region from a supposed absence to a region of active human shaping. Where once the forest was romanticized as untouched, it now appears as a co-created landscape. People amplified particular species, engineered soils, and reworked hydrology so that the forest itself became a managed partner in production. Perhaps the most poetic element of this revelation is how quiet it is. The clues beneath the canopy are not ostentatious. They do not demand attention with marble staircases or towering statues. Rather, they persist as subtle geometry, as dark soils that bloom when plowed, as mounds that form the bones of vanished neighborhoods. Decades of methodical work have taught archaeologists to listen for these understated signatures, to see in a line of trees the echo of a road, and in a scatter of pottery the outline of a plaza. The Amazon's past is written in a muted hand. To read it requires patience, humility, and a willingness to recalibrate what counts as proof. As our reconnaissance ends and we move deeper into excavation and analysis, the forest's clues continue to multiply. Each mapped causeway, each sampled profile of terra preta, each LiDAR slice through the canopy adds a stitch to a tapestry that had been misread for centuries. The canopy, once thought to be proof of emptiness, has become the carrier of evidence. It preserves what stone does not, sheltering the traces that tell a different story of human ingenuity. The forest did not erase those people. It wrapped them in a green archive, patient and slow, waiting for instruments and imaginations to catch up. In the narratives that follow, we will follow specific landscapes, the geoglyph-rich plains, the networked Xingu, and the filamentary settlements along the Tapajos, tracing how individual clues cohere into a regional strategy of life. For now, the lesson is plain. Beneath the canopy, a language of earthworks and engineered soils records an ancient competence. To hear it, we only need to learn the grammar.
If you were to dig a shallow pit anywhere under the Amazon's green carpet, most places would yield the same story. A thin layer of humus, then hard red or yellow oxisol, acidic, leached, poor in the nutrients European agriculture prizes. These are soils that, by textbook logic, should starve crops, not nurture empires. Yet here and there, like secret pockets of night in a field of day, are soils that tell a very different tale. Terra preta, literally black earth. It is darker, richer, chunky with charcoal and pottery fragments, and when a shovel breaks into it, the smell is different too. A living, loamy fragrance that promises fertility.
For scientists, this is both a puzzle and a key. Where terra preta occurs, fields flourish. Where it is absent, forests dominate without obvious signs of past cultivation. The presence of this soil rewrites how we must imagine pre-Columbian life in the basin. Terra preta is not an accident of geology. It is an archaeological signature, an engineered soil created by people. Its most visible ingredient is charcoal, not the residue of uncontrolled fires, but the product of deliberate low-temperature combustions, often called charcoalized organic matter, or in modern parlance, biochar. Mixed with pottery shards, bone fragments, food waste, human excrement, and other organic detritus, this charcoal-rich matrix forms a sponge. It holds nutrients, improves water retention, and resists the rapid microbial breakdown that, in tropical climates, usually drains fertility away. Once made, terra preta tends to persist for centuries, even millennia. It does not wash away with the rains. It transforms the landscape into productive ground where continuous cultivation is possible without the frequent fallow cycles that would otherwise be required. The implications are profound. In a basin of apparently poor soils, terra preta is ecological technology, evidence that people found ways to store fertility, to fold waste into productive systems, and to scale agriculture beyond what the raw geology would allow. It is the silent proof that long-term intensive cultivation was not merely possible, but practiced and perfected. Where terra preta clusters, archaeologists also find denser settlement patterns, mounds, plazas, pottery scatters. The soils do more than feed crops. They anchor populations. They are the foundation upon which the Amazonian garden cities could exist. How did they do it? The short answer? They turned waste into wealth. The process appears to have been iterative and communal. Charcoal was produced from burned wood and plant residue, often via controlled smoldering rather than open flames, producing a porous, stable carbon. This charcoal mixed with kitchen waste, broken pottery, bones, and vegetable matter created a matrix that slowly sequestered phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients in forms plants could access. The fragmented pottery in the mix likely functioned as grit and structure, aiding drainage and creating microhabitats for microbes that help cycle nutrients. Human fecal matter, processed by thyme and charcoal, restored what diets and tropical leaching had removed. The result was soil that not only supported crops, but improved with use. It was soil as technology, intentionally manufactured, maintained, and inherited. Archaeological trenches across the basin reveal the signatures of this practice. Soil profiles show repeated layers, dark anthropogenic horizons interleaved with natural deposits. Carbon-14 dates from charcoal fragments embedded in these layers stretch back many centuries, demonstrating long-term continuity of practice. The carbon in the charcoal is remarkably stable, resistant to decomposition, meaning that the people who made terra preta effectively invested in long-term fertility for their descendants. This is a form of capital, ecological, social, and intergenerational. Managing soil in this way requires labor and cooperation, but it also produces resilience. During shortages or climate variability, these engineered plots would have buffered communities against failure.
Terra preta also changes our assumptions about crop choices and cultivation systems. Instead of expansive monocultures, Amazonian farmers likely practiced polyculture, orchards and gardens blending manioc, maize in some zones, squashes, beans, and useful tree species. Forest gardens, today still practiced in many indigenous communities, are living laboratories that mirror archaeological inferences. Layered plantings, fruit and nut trees interspersed with tubers and medicinal plants, and managed wild species encouraged to proliferate. The engineered soil supports this complexity. Better moisture retention and nutrient availability
favor mixed agroforestry over single crop dependence. These systems are fundamentally sustainable because they mimic the forest's vertical diversity rather than flattening it for a single short-term yield. The archaeological evidence aligns with ethno-historical records and living practices. Many indigenous traditions include techniques that enrich soil through burning, composting, and plant management. Oral histories remember large villages with orchards and managed forest plots. Ethnographers documenting contemporary forest gardeners have recorded methods that produce localized darkening of soils and improved yields, methods that resemble, in functional terms, the creation of terra preta. This continuity suggests a cultural knowledge transmitted across generations, recipes for soil, rituals for maintenance, and social institutions to manage communal spaces. The geographic distribution of terra preta is also revealing. It is concentrated in certain ecological niches, often along river floodplains, near settlement clusters, and in ecotonal zones where upland and floodplain meet. Such placement hints at strategic choices: proximity to water and transport, access to diverse microenvironments, and the capacity to move organic waste conveniently into productive plots. The spatial pattern reinforces the idea that the landscape was a managed mosaic, each patch optimized for particular crops and functions. Terra preta did not blanket the Amazon. It was deployed where it mattered most, where people needed to secure long-term yields. Beyond household gardens, there is evidence of broader landscape engineering. Raised fields, elevated platforms of soil and organic matter appear in places as a way to cope with seasonal flooding. Canals and fish weirs manage aquatic resources, and floodplain terraces capture sediments and keep crops above inundation. In combination with terra preta, these features form a toolkit for making a watery, nutrient-poor world productive. The sophistication of that toolkit undercuts the old argument that the Amazon could only host dispersed, mobile peoples. Instead, it points to planned agricultural systems that could support sizable and stable populations. There is also a global echo to the story of terra preta. Modern agronomists and climate scientists have become fascinated by biochar, the contemporary analog of ancient charcoal-enriched soils, precisely because it offers a way to sequester carbon and improve degraded soils. Experiments in creating biochar-amended soils show improved water retention and nutrient use efficiency in many contexts. The ancient Amazonian practice thus has unexpected relevance. It is an indigenous technology with potential to inform sustainable agriculture and climate mitigation strategies today. But this modern interest must be tempered with respect. The soils were the product of long-term local knowledge and social arrangements, not a simple recipe to be extracted and scaled without context. Debates remain among scientists about the scale and intensity of terra preta production. Some scholars argue for large, deliberate intentionality, communal composting, and planned enrichment across broad swaths, while others suggest more localized, cumulative effects of household practices that, over generations, created larger patches. The evidence likely supports both. Small-scale household enrichments can aggregate into extensive black soils if practices persist across time and space. Either way, the presence of terra preta confirms that people were not passive occupants of the Amazon. They were active engineers of its fertility. This reorientation of understanding also reframes population estimates. If soils could sustain continuous cultivation, and if forest gardens and raised fields supplemented diets with diverse resources, then pre-contact populations in certain regions could have been much higher than earlier models allowed. Dense, low-rise settlement systems, households scattered across plazas and mounds, feeding from enriched gardens and engineered hydrology, could sustain large communities without the vertical density of stone cities. The demographic consequences are vast. Larger populations imply complex social institutions, political coordination, and the capacity for organized labor on roads, causeways, and earthworks. Terra preta, then, is not just agricultural technology, it is a signature of social scale. The creation and maintenance of these soils also suggest particular social dynamics. Producing terra preta requires inputs, charcoal, food waste, pottery, and time that accumulate best where people live in stable places. It is therefore bound up with ideas of property, stewardship, and communal labor. The soils may have been managed communally in some places and household by household in others. Rituals or taboos could have regulated who could add what to the mix, when and how, embedding ecological practice within cultural meaning. The long-term stability of terra preta suggests institutions that valued inheritance and the passing on of productive plots to kin groups, melding ecology and kinship into a durable landscape. We should also consider terra preta's role in resilience. In unpredictable environments, engineering fertility is risk management. During droughts or floods, pockets of enriched soil could support staple yields that sustained communities. In times of demographic stress, these enriched patches might have allowed some continuity of subsistence while broader social networks reorganized. The practice is thus not merely efficient, it is adaptive. It allowed people to live with uncertainty, to buffer shocks, and to maintain the social capacities needed for collective action. The permanence of terra preta holds another lesson. Environmental transformation does not always equal degradation. In the Amazon, people shaped ecosystems in ways that increased productivity and biodiversity simultaneously. Forest gardens that combine domesticated and wild species create habitats that are both useful and resilient, supporting food security while preserving habitats. This challenges simplistic narratives that cast pre-Columbian humans as catastrophically altering environments or as incidental occupants. Instead, they emerge as gardeners at landscape scale, intensive, intentional, and sophisticated. Finally, terra preta tells a moral story about attention and memory. Soil is an archive written in slow time. It records what people ate, how they burned, how they discarded, and how they invested in the future. The black earth is a human ledger, charcoal as capital, pottery as structure, bone and waste as inputs to productivity. Reading it requires patience and humility. It also asks that we recognize technological creativity wherever it appears, even when expressed in humble materials. As we step back from the dark pits and the microscope slides, the picture grows clear. Terra preta is not a curiosity, it is an emblem, a material proof of a people who learned to transform one of Earth's most challenging landscapes into a place that could sustain life, culture, and complexity. Their soils sustained farms, their farms sustained plazas, their plazas sustained peoples. By making Earth that should not have been fertile into an enduring substrate for life, they left a testimony that the Amazon's apparent emptiness was never natural, but a silence created by time, disease, and the peculiar blindness of observers who looked only for monuments of stone. In the sections that follow, we will see how those soils sat alongside waterworks, roads, and social institutions, how gardens, canals, and plazas formed a coherent strategy for life in the rainforest. For now, hold the image, a small black patch of earth under palms and lianas, steaming after rain, smelling of life. In that smell is a kind of stubborn intelligence, the slow, patient technology of people who refused to be limited by their soil, and in doing so, reshaped the meaning of civilization beneath the canopy.
When we think of a city, our minds often leap to stone, walls, columns, and monuments that outlast storms and centuries. The Amazon cities did not build in that register. They built in wood, palm, soil, and river. Their architecture was designed for a living, wet world that refused permanence in stone, but rewarded ingenuity in adaptation. To call them cities without stone is not to diminish them. It is to recognize a different logic of durability, one rooted in movement, renewal, and ecological intimacy. From the air, Amazonian settlement clusters often look like soft geometry, flattened plazas, rings of raised mounds, linear causeways, and the faint ghosts of canal networks. On the ground, those outlines translate into wooden houses on mounded platforms, palisades, open communal structures, and intricate systems of raised pathways. The building materials were perishable by choice and necessity. Abundant palm, hardwoods, and thatch allowed quick repair, efficient thermal regulation, and architectural forms that responded to flooding, humidity, and forest life. Rather than resisting the environment, these communities folded it into their design. The plaza was the heart of this urbanism. Across the basin, archaeologists document plazas, intentionally leveled, often large open spaces, framed by domestic mounds in public structures. Plazas hosted markets, public assemblies, rituals, and athletic contests. They were social capacitors where information and goods moved fast. Around them, household mounds rose just enough to keep living floors dry in high water. On these mounds stood houses elevated on posts, with steep thatch roofs shedding rain like a practiced skill. Because structures were built on wood, they could be repaired, replaced, or enlarged as needs changed. The result was a city that grew like a living organism, modular, repairable, and resilient. Roads and causeways were the arteries connecting these modules. Raised paths, sometimes narrow footways, sometimes broad causeways, allowed movement year-round, crossing marsh and seasonal floodplain. Constructed from layered soils, often stabilized with brush, timber, and in some cases stone reinforcement, these roadways demonstrate logistical planning. Imagine a procession moving along a raised line between plazas, traders with baskets, canoe portages, and festival processions, marking ritual time. The lines are literal proof of social connection, corridors for trade, administration, and ceremony. Water management infrastructure was equally central. In a landscape shaped by river rhythms, people invested in canals, reservoirs, fish weirs, and raised fields. Canals channeled water to fish trapping systems and irrigated tree gardens. Reservoirs stored water for dry periods. Raised agricultural platforms kept crops above seasonal inundation. These features are not the accretions of random adaptation, but deliberate technologies of food security. They turned hydrological variability from a hazard into a predictable resource, supporting dense settlement without dependence on distant granaries or imported staples. The absence of stone brought social forms that differed from the Old World city-states. There were few towering palaces etched in marble. Instead, power was expressed through networks, controlled access to productive land, the ability to coordinate labor for causeway construction, the maintenance of ceremonial calendars, and the management of exchange across watersheds. Political authority likely rested on coalitions of kin groups and ritual specialists, with ranking that could be negotiated and renewed through ceremonial performance rather than immovable monuments. Leadership was performative, relational, and often anchored in stewardship of canals, orchards, and plazas rather than an architectural permanence. Domestic architecture, multiplied across plazas, reveals everyday life. Excavations expose post holes, compacted floors, hearths, and refuse pits. Household compounds often contain specialized spaces, work areas for weaving, cooking, and pottery, storage pits for manioc and other staples, and small enclosures for craft specialists. The archaeological signature of craft, concentrated fragments of pottery, shell-working debris,
and bone tool production indicate specialized labor and likely local markets. Craftspeople plugged into a circulation of goods, pottery styles that echo across regions, traded exotic shells and stones, and ritual paraphernalia that reflect shared cosmologies. These items testify to a level of economic complexity that belies the absence of monumental stone. Cities without stone also meant cities that left subtler marks on the landscape. Roots and soil chemistry remember what wood and thatch erased. Post-hole stains, hearth lenses, and compacted floors persist as negative spaces in soil profiles. These signatures enable archaeologists to reconstruct house plans, neighborhood organization, and activity areas. Because organic building materials break down, the archaeological method here privileges microstratigraphy, soil chemistry, and geomorphology. Where stone-built civilizations shout their presence across millennia, these places whisper, and scholars must learn to read the quiet. Social space in the Amazonian city was intimately entangled with ecology. Domestic gardens, the forest gardens described earlier, surrounded homes and provided diverse subsistence. Fruit and nut trees, medicinal plants, vines, and understory crops were managed in multi-layered plots that blurred the line between forest and farm. Such gardens provided nutritional diversity, seasonal buffers, and a constant stream of useful materials. Households managed microecologies, and in doing so, accumulated ecological capital. Tree species planted to mark property, specialized orchards tended by lineages, and cooperative guardianship of key resources like fish runs and clay deposits. In cities without stone, the landscape itself was an infrastructural asset.
Public architecture likewise reflected performance rather than permanence. Large communal halls or open plazas could host dramatic ritual cycles, seasonal markets, or juridical assemblies. Wooden poles, flags, and ephemeral decorations created a sensory spectacle during festivals. These performances bound disparate households into civic identities. Oral histories preserved among Amazonian peoples today recall ritual centers where people gathered for exchange and marriage alliances. Echoes of institutional forms archaeologists now find material corroboration for. The political glue was social ritual, anchored in places that could be remade season by season. Defense and visibility took other forms. Palisades and ditches could be constructed to protect villages. Strategic placement of mounds and causeways could create choke points or control trade routes. Military architecture wasn't monumental ramparts, but landscape choreography, choosing places that were defensible for tactical reasons, using waterways as barriers, and integrating mobility into strategy. Mobility itself was a defense. The ability to relocate along connected networks of plazas and gardens allowed communities to respond to environmental or social stressors without total collapse. The ephemeral character of architecture affected memory and heritage. Without stone to anchor legend, oral tradition and landscape names carried ancestral memory. Stories about great houses or ancestral plazas are embedded in song and ritual. Indigenous cosmologies often integrate the past into present stewardship, planting trees for future generations, maintaining sacred groves, and observing taboos that preserve species. These cultural systems substitute for the permanence of stone by embedding memory in practice rather than monument. Memory becomes a set of acts, maintenance, planting, ritual, that recapitulate history through living culture. The perishable nature of building materials also shaped archaeological visibility in ways that skewed early understandings. European explorers and 19th century scientists sought stone and were blind to soft materials. Ironically, the Amazon's choice of perishability created a form of resilience. Wooden architecture can be renewed, adapted, and recycled. Timber from old houses becomes material for new construction. Thatch roofs are replaced seasonally. This cyclical use creates a living urbanism where renewal is built into design. The people who lived here engineered a system where materials were part of a regenerative economy, not inert monuments. Yet the fragility of their material culture has not erased complexity. When archaeologists combine LiDAR's macro-scale vision of plazas and causeways with micro-excavations revealing post holes and hearths, a composite urban portrait emerges. Large plazas indicate coordinated public life. Clustered mounds outline neighborhood units. Canals and reservoirs map food strategies. Together, these elements create the logic of a city: dense social interaction, economic specialization, political coordination, and cultural production. The absence of stone does not equal absence of urban life. Rather, it signals a different urban grammar, one tuned to timeliness, repair, and ecological integration. This urban grammar has implications for how we understand pre-contact social organization. It suggests that Amazonian polities could achieve complexity without centralizing power in monumental architecture. Networks of medium-sized centers could cooperate and compete. Alliances could form along trade corridors. Ritual calendars could coordinate labor for infrastructure maintenance. Social power was portable, negotiated, and resilient. Authority was exercised through stewardship and ritual legitimacy rather than permanent palaces. Such forms of governance are instructive. They show alternatives to concentration and monumentalization, emphasizing distributed capacity and ecological intelligence. Archaeology also points to diversity in scale and form. Not every settlement was a large plaza complex. Many were small nodes integrated into wider networks. Some places show evidence of more centralized control, larger plazas, greater artifact densities, and signs of specialized production, while others reflect more egalitarian patterns. The mosaic is rich. Varying scales of organization, local polities nested within regional networks, and shifting centers of influence across centuries. The lack of stone unifies this diversity by compelling us to look for social signatures in soil, road alignments, and ritual paraphernalia rather than in towers. Finally, the story of cities without stone compels a rethinking of preservation and heritage. Modern conservation must reckon with landscapes where cultural patrimony is embedded in living practices and dynamic ecologies. Preserving such places means supporting indigenous stewardship, documenting oral histories, and protecting the ecological processes that sustain cultural systems. It also means acknowledging past erasures, demographic collapse, and colonial disruption, and working with descendant communities to honor memory in forms that matter to them. In the end, the Amazon cities teach a lesson in humility. They remind us that architectural permanence is not the only measure of human achievement. Durability in wood, soil, and water is a different, sometimes more subtle, often wiser answer to the question of how people make a home. Their cities were designed to breathe with the forest, to be mended and reimagined across generations, to convert the flux of rivers and seasons into the steady work of community. If we have been slow to recognize them, it is because we mistook our own models of greatness for the only ones that mattered. Standing now in a cleared plaza, with the hum of insects filling the air and a thin line of raised earth pointing toward another cluster of mounds, the absence of stone feels less like a lack and more like an ethics, an architecture of reciprocity, where the city is a conversation between people and place, built, maintained, and remembered in the living language of wood, soil, and water.
You cannot tell this story only from aerial maps and soil cores. The other half of the archive lives in voices, in songs, place names, kinship lists, and the ceremonial memory of people who still live by the rivers once crossed by causeways. To meet the Amazon's past, we must meet its descendants, the Kwikuro, the Kayapo, and other indigenous communities whose lives and stories stitch the archaeological traces into human history. Their memories do more than embellish the data. They provide the social grammar for how plazas were used, why orchards were arranged the way they were, and how networks of exchange and ritual actually functioned. Take the Kwikuro. In the headwaters of the Xingu, Anthropologists working closely with Kwikuro elders and leaders helped reveal an archaeological landscape now known as Kuhikugu, a complex of sites, plazas, and mounds spread across the forest that may once have supported tens of thousands of people. Michael Heckenberger's work, done with Kwikuro collaboration, is an exemplar of how indigenous knowledge can guide scientific inquiry. People who know the land by name pointed researchers toward the mounded plazas, described ancestral settlement patterns, and explained social practices that align with what archaeologists found in the dirt. That partnership did not merely provide corroboration, it changed what scientists were looking for and how they interpreted ambiguous features in the landscape. What once looked like a collection of depressions became a living map when Kwikuro memory filled the gaps. The Kwikuro also anchor a different kind of continuity, living practices that echo ancient technologies. Fieldwork has documented that Kwikuro and other Xingu peoples manage forest gardens, plant and tend diverse useful species, and maintain soil practices that produce localized darkening of soils functionally similar to the ancient terra preta. Recent presentations and studies show these are not mere chance resemblances. Some contemporary practices intentionally produce charcoal-enriched, productive soils around villages, a powerful piece of evidence for cultural transmission. In other words, the techniques that archaeologists detect in the ground are not all dead technologies. They survive in practice, ritual, and daily tending. The Kayapo, whose lands run along tributaries of the Xingu and farther afield, provide another lens. Their cultural memory and recent activism make them one of the most visible indigenous voices in debates over Amazonian heritage and environment. Kayapo elders and storytellers preserve narratives of ancestral villages, ritual centers, and migration that map onto features LiDAR and survey work now reveal. Ethnographic films and collaborations, including creative projects that dramatize Kayapo stories, have put those memories into public view, not as romantic folklore, but as history with political stakes. These narratives underpin territorial claims, resource management, and resistance to extractive projects. The Kayapo's recent history, their collective organizing against dams and deforestation, is continuous with an older practice of mobilizing social institutions to protect and steward resources. This is a political story as much as an archaeological one. For centuries, colonial and later state actors erased or disregarded indigenous land claims by presenting the Amazon as empty. The archaeological reclamation of a dense, managed past chips away at that narrative, but the process of recognition is not neutral. When scientists and governments accept that the landscape was shaped by people, legal and moral questions follow. Who owns the right to manage or profit from these soils, plazas, and ancestral roots? Which communities hold custodial responsibility? In many places, indigenous peoples have long argued that their stewardship is continuous, that ritual obligations and place names encode tenure, and that archaeological research should be collaborative and accountable. These are not theoretical objections, they shape how sites are researched, published, and ultimately protected. Oral history often provides details impossible to recover through excavation alone. Stories describe plazas as places for seasonal gatherings, marriages, ritual cycles, and juridical decision-making. Songs encode sequences of movement along routes that match causeways LiDAR reveals. Names for species and groves often preserve memory of planting regimes and curated orchards. Elders can point to tree clusters that mark former house plots, or map social territories by reciting lines of descent tied to specific patches of land. These memories are not static nostalgia. They are dynamic repositories of ecological knowledge, how to sow, what to plant where, and why a particular copal or Brazil nut tree stands where it does. Archaeologists increasingly accept that these living testimonies are essential data,
not optional color. Ethnography also reshapes our sense of scale. When a remote sensing map shows a scatter of mounds and plazas across tens or hundreds of square kilometers, it can be easy to imagine disconnected clusters. But when a Kwikuro elder describes the rhythms of mobility, seasonal fairs, canoe-based trade routes, intermarriage alliances stretching across tributaries, the geospatial pattern becomes social life. Roads are not inert lines. They are roots of obligation and reciprocity. Plazas are not empty nodes. They are stages for performance, where status is enacted and labor organized. Reading the material traces through the lens of lived practice makes the network literal, a lattice of relationships that move people, goods, ideas, and ritual meanings across landscape.
The relationship between archaeology and indigenous knowledge has not always been easy. Early researchers sometimes treated oral testimony as unreliable. That posture is changing, but the shift requires careful practice. Collaboration must be built on consent, fair exchange, and recognition of indigenous intellectual property. Too often, ancient soils and artifacts become the basis for outside initiatives, museums, academic careers, or commercial interests, with little benefit for local communities. Contemporary projects are increasingly designed to reverse that pattern. Co-creation of research agendas, training of indigenous researchers, shared publications, and local stewardship programs that use archaeological insight to strengthen land rights. Successful work has shown how archaeology done with communities yields richer, more ethical scholarship and material protections for sites that matter deeply to descendants. Cultural continuity also surfaces in material forms. Pottery styles persist in motifs and techniques. Weaving patterns echo ceremonial cloth seen in non-perishable artifacts. Foods recorded in midden deposits correspond to plant species still tended in gardens. In Kuikugu and other Shingu sites, the archaeological assemblage, ceramics, bone tools, and traces of domestic architecture resonates with Kuikuro knowledge of craft and household organization. These resonances are not coincidence. They are the product of cultural transmission across centuries and through catastrophic interruption. Recognizing that continuity complicates simple notions of collapse. Even after demographic shocks, cultural threads remain, reconfigured but alive. There is a hard honesty in many oral accounts about disease and loss. Stories recount the arrival of strangers with new sicknesses, the rapid ebbing of villages, and the forest's quiet settling back over emptied plazas. Those narratives align chillingly with epidemiological estimates of demographic collapse after European contact. For descendants, archaeology returning the visible traces of plazas and causeways is not just an academic vindication, it is a form of recovery, a way to honor lost kin and rebuild memory into contemporary political claims. In the Shingu, communities have used archaeological collaboration to assert territorial sovereignty and defend against encroachment, turning scientific recognition into legal and moral leverage. Yet the present is not a mere echo of the past. Indigenous societies today are vibrant, inventive, and politically active. The Kayapo's well-known environmental campaigns during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, mobilizing media, legal systems, and international allies to oppose destructive dams and logging, are contemporary extensions of deep practices of stewardship and placemaking. That activism is informed by historical memory and archaeological knowledge alike. Asserting deep time occupation provides a stronger claim in public forums against narratives that treat the forest as terra nullius. In other words, archaeology and oral history together can be strategic tools in modern struggles for rights and conservation. Importantly, the transmission of knowledge is not limited to elders or ceremonial specialists. Younger generations weave together formal education, digital mapping skills, and ancestral knowledge to create hybrid practices of stewardship. In some regions, indigenous youth learn LiDAR interpretation alongside elders' place names. They co-produce maps that become legal evidence in land claims. Indigenous-led research initiatives train community members in excavation methods, GPS mapping, and archival work. This collaborative, intergenerational exchange revitalizes cultural memory while strengthening the capacity for political negotiation in contexts of land pressure and ecological change. There are also ethical questions about how to handle human remains, sacred sites, and ritual paraphernalia uncovered in the field. For many communities, certain places and objects carry spiritual obligations that cannot be reduced to data points. Archaeologists working with indigenous partners have increasingly adopted protocols respecting reburial, restricted access, and shared decision-making about publication. These practices acknowledge that the past is not simply a resource for science. It is the living foundation of spiritual and social life for descendants. When such protocols are honored, research not only discovers but also heals, enabling dialogues that respect loss and support cultural regeneration. The stories the people tell also point to a broader epistemological lesson. Indigenous knowledge systems are sophisticated ways of knowing ecology. Plant taxonomies, phenological observations, soil use recipes, and coordinated labor schedules are knowledge infrastructures accumulated through centuries of practice. They were not primitive notes awaiting validation. They were working technologies. Archaeology benefits when it treats these systems as theories worth testing, rather than folklore to be cataloged. Working together, scientists and indigenous communities have begun to translate living practice into forms that complement remote sensing and excavation, giving fuller meaning to causeways, orchards, and dark soils seen in the data. Finally, meaning the people of the network restores agency to the story. Rather than rendering indigenous peoples passive victims of environmental determinism or historical catastrophe, the combined evidence shows them as architects of a durable, place-based civilization. Their choices, to plant, to burn carefully, to build raised roads, to organize labor for communal projects, were intentional strategies, not accidental byproducts. Listening to their voices recovers the logic of those choices and reframes the past as a series of informed, creative responses to a challenging environment. As we move from voice to excavation and back again, the map comes alive. The satellite line becomes a procession of canoes. The plaza becomes a market where stories are traded as much as manioc. The soil profile becomes a ledger of generations who invested charcoal and bone into a shared future. The people of the network are not merely sources for data. They are the heirs, interpreters, and rightful custodians of a human landscape that reminds us powerfully, history is made by people who speak and sing, plant and bury, mourn and remember. And their stories are the final, indispensable evidence of the civilization beneath the Amazon.
The first arrival of Europeans in the Amazon did not immediately produce visible ruins. It produced, in the span of a few decades, something far more lethal and more silent, demographic collapse on a scale that reshaped ecosystems as surely as any flood. The story of the Amazon's vanished cities is inseparable from the story of disease, social disintegration, and ecological recovery. To understand the silence that greeted 19th century explorers, the quiet plazas overgrown, the roads reclaimed by roots, we must confront the invisible engines of catastrophe that emptied the basin of people and left the forest to reassert itself. Disease was the principal agent. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens brought by Europeans encountered populations without prior exposure or immunity. Where Old World societies had centuries of recurrent epidemics that selected for partial immunity, Amazonian populations had no such history. The result was catastrophic.
waves of mortality that, in many regions, reduced populations by 50 to 90% within a few generations after sustained contact. Social networks collapsed as elders, ritual specialists, and key cultivators died. Knowledge transmission was interrupted, labor pools depleted. Fields lay fallow, canals silted, and maintenance of causeways and reservoirs ceased. In that absence, the forest moved quickly to reclaim the domestic fabric. Archaeologists and historians reconstruct this demographic catastrophe from several converging lines of evidence. Colonial records sometimes document population figures for mission towns and riverine settlements, showing steep declines over decades. Archaeological site sequences show abandonment horizons, layers where occupation deposits end abruptly and are followed by soil development consistent with forest regrowth. Pollen and phytolith records in sediment cores sometimes show the decline of cultivated taxa and the reemergence of forest species. Where terra preta hints at long-standing cultivation, post-contact layers indicate abrupt decreases in the anthropogenic signal. Together, these datasets sketch a narrative. As mortality surged, the socio-ecological systems that underwrote dense settlement unraveled. The social consequences were as profound as the demographic ones. Communities that once coordinated labor for large projects like road maintenance, canal clearing, and plaza leveling lacked the human resources to do so. Political institutions based on ritual reciprocity and alliance building were strained beyond repair. Practices that depended on extended networks, marriage exchanges that bound distant plazas, ritual cycles that marshaled labor could not be sustained when entire kin groups vanished. This institutional collapse compounded the biological catastrophe, accelerating abandonment and scattering survivors into smaller, more mobile groups. The loss of ritual specialists and elders is particularly consequential. In societies where knowledge about planting calendars, seed selection, drainage maintenance, and ritual obligations is transmitted orally and embodied in practice, losing key custodians of knowledge means losing the social technology that made those landscapes productive. Without ritual timing, labor mobilization falters. Without seed knowledge, plant diversity declines. The ecosystems these societies had cultivated, orchards, enriched soils, fish weirs, depended on continuous human stewardship. When that stewardship stopped, ecosystems shifted toward a different equilibrium. Secondary forest replaced orchards, canals silted, and the visible marks of human design faded under leaf litter. European colonization also introduced structural changes that worsened decline. Enslavement, forced missionization, and extractive economies removed people from their lands and disrupted social networks. Some communities were forcibly relocated, others fled into remote headwaters to escape violence and coercion. Where European labor demands concentrated people in mission towns, these aggregations became vectors for outbreaks, accelerating mortality. Simultaneously, the introduction of new economic incentives, rubber extraction, cattle ranching, and later commodity-oriented agriculture reconfigured land use in ways that often severed links between people and traditional management techniques. Thus, the post-contact era was not a single event, but a cascade of disruptions, disease, displacement, and economic coercion layered together. Ecological recovery following demographic collapse was fast in tropical terms. The Amazon is prodigious at reclaiming open ground. Within a few decades, abandoned fields sprout pioneers. Within a century, trees can generate closed canopy again. Roots break through compacted floors. Leaf litter builds humus. Soil microfauna and fungi reestablish cycles that obscure negative archaeological signatures. Many anthropogenic features, wooden posts, palm-thatched roofs and woven fences rot away in a few decades. The visible skyline of a settlement collapses, and what remains are soil signals, charcoal lenses, pottery scatter, and elevated mounds. To a 19th century naturalist who expected carved stone and enduring monuments, the regrown forest looked like primordial necessity rather than historic consequence.
The process of rewilding also had longer-term ecological consequences. Where orchards and managed groves receded, biodiversity patterns shifted. Some domesticated or encouraged species declined, while generalist forest species expanded. In places where people had maintained plot mosaics that favored particular fruit or nut trees, subsequent forest succession might not preferentially preserve those taxa, especially if seed dispersal agents or human tending were absent. As the forest closed, the distinct patchwork that had signaled anthropogenic land use blurred into a more homogeneous forest matrix, in which subtle soil chemistry remained the only durable trace. Historical invisibility has political and intellectual consequences that persist today. For centuries, scientists and officials interpreted the Amazon's regrown state as natural, a pristine wilderness unaffected by human history. That interpretation justified policies and discourses that marginalized indigenous claims to historical stewardship. The narrative of empty nature fit colonial and later national projects that saw the region as terra nullius, land available for extraction, conversion, and settlement by outsiders. Putting human history back into the forest complicates those legacies. The presence of ancient, engineered landscapes supports contemporary claims to land rights, to stewardship practices, and to knowledge systems that deserve legal and political recognition. The silence also shaped scientific practice itself. Early archaeological and ecological models were calibrated to the idea of minimal human impact. Sampling strategies and theoretical frameworks often treated cultural traces as anomalies. Only with sustained multidisciplinary research, combining paleoecology, archaeology, remote sensing, and indigenous testimony, did the reality of dense pre-contact occupation gain traction. The work of rewriting the Amazon's history is therefore as much epistemic as it is empirical. It required questioning foundational assumptions about what counts as evidence and who can be a credible informant. The human toll of collapse is more than data points. It is a set of human stories of loss and resilience. Survivors adapted in different ways. Some retreated into smaller, more mobile groups. Others aggregated around mission towns or fled to uplands. Some maintained elements of their horticultural knowledge and adapted it to new circumstances. The descendants of those survivors carried memory in fragmentary forms, place names, planting practices, songs that recall grander gatherings. In many places, later colonial and republican histories overwrote indigenous presence, but traces persisted in household gardens, in the species mix along paths, and in material culture repurposed for new contexts. Understanding collapse also requires recognizing variation in impact. The Amazon is vast and heterogeneous. Demographic decline was not uniform. Some regions experienced catastrophic depopulation early. Others saw more gradual changes or even continuity in certain practices. In pockets where indigenous communities retained control of territories or were less exposed to colonial contact, maintenance of landscape features could persist for longer. Archaeologists must therefore resist teleological narratives of total collapse and consider local trajectories, survivals, and reconfigurations. A sober reckoning with collapse does not end in fatalism. It opens urgent questions about reparation, cultural revitalization, and ecological stewardship. Recognizing the intentionality behind terra preta, raised fields, and canal networks strengthens claims by indigenous and local communities that they have been stewards of the basin for centuries. It supports arguments for legal protections,
collaborative conservation approaches, and the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in contemporary land management. Where the forest reclaimed human works, it did not abolish human responsibility. The memory of stewardship invites contemporary societies to learn from past success. How do we balance production and biodiversity, plan for hydrological variability, and invest in long-term ecological capital? As we move on from the silence, we must do so with humility. The forest's regrowth is not a moral blank slate. It is the wound and the witness of destruction. Archaeology and ethnography together do more than reconstruct a lost past. They testify to a human world that was erased in ways that continued to shape present politics and ecology. The next phases of our story will show how modern science, LiDAR flights, soil chemistry, and collaborative fieldwork lifts the canopy's veil and reveals networks of people who were once everywhere in the basin. But we will carry forward the lesson of collapse, that past vulnerability and resilience are entangled, and that any recovery of history must center the voices and rights of those who still live in the Amazon's human and more than human communities.
For most of the 20th century, the Amazon's past sat behind the green curtain, a story told in fragments and disputations. Now, instruments that read the world differently have rewritten that story. LiDAR pulses that slip between leaves, satellite sensors that detect subtle soil signatures, and careful radiocarbon work have together turned what was once a silence into a chorus of evidence. The result is not a tidy replacement of myth with certainty, but a profound reconception. The Amazon harbored organized, long-term, and regionally connected societies whose scale and sophistication demand a redefinition of what civilization can mean. The most dramatic demonstration of this shift comes from airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging. Where ground survey is slow and canopy makes visual inspection almost impossible, LiDAR produces a digital skin of the land beneath the trees. It measures tiny differences in elevation and then subtracts the canopy, revealing terraces, causeways, plazas, ring ditches, and reservoir edges as if a veil had been lifted. Across the Bolivian Llanos de Mojos, the upper Xingu, and parts of southwest Amazonia, LiDAR surveys have exposed settlement geometries at scales that were previously only guessed at. Where 19th century naturalists saw only forest, we now see patterned landscapes, networks of plazas threaded by roads and waterworks, visible with a clarity that changes interpretation. One landmark study used LiDAR across 200 square kilometers of Bolivian floodplain and found evidence of what the authors called low-density urbanism. Broad civic plazas, defensive ditches, long causeways, and elaborate water management infrastructures. These features are not isolated curiosities. They form integrated systems designed to control flood cycles, manage fisheries, and support sustained agriculture over long timescales. The structures uncovered in these surveys demonstrate planning, labor coordination, and engineering knowledge of a scale comparable in function, if not in vertical monumentality, to some early urban centers elsewhere in the world. The implication is simple but seismic. Urbanism need not look like uniform density and stone to be a fully social and political achievement. Complementary work, high-resolution satellite imagery, geophysical prospection, field excavation, and soil chemistry completes the picture. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal lenses and occupation deposits anchor many of these LiDAR visible features in time, revealing centuries-long sequences of occupation in numerous regions. Where terra preta and raised field complexes appear alongside plazas and causeways, archaeologists can link garden cities to the infrastructural investments they required. In short, the lines that LiDAR draws are not decorative. They correspond to places where people tended soils, moved goods, and organized shared labor. Together with soil analysis and artifactual study, they convert topographic pattern into human narrative. The redefinition of Amazonian social complexity also rests on ethnographic and collaborative work. Scholars who have worked closely with descendant communities, as Michael Heckenberger's decades of fieldwork in the Upper Xingu illustrate, remind us that material features in the ground come with living cultural logics. Longhouse orientations, plazas for exchange and ritual, and patterns of orchards preserved in oral memory all resonate with the archaeological record. Field researchers, working alongside indigenous collaborators, translate remote sensing geometries into lived places. A causeway becomes a procession route, a plaza becomes a place of political talk and feasting, and a series of fish weirs becomes a seasonal system for food security. This collaboration both strengthens archaeological inference and restores agency to the peoples whose technologies and institutions produced the landscapes now revealed. What does this mean for population and political models? For decades, estimates of pre-contact Amazonian population were conservative because models assumed that the basin's poor soils could not support large densities. But evidence of engineered soils, raised fields, and managed riverine systems, when combined with the spatial reach of plazas and roads, supports higher population estimates in many regions. Low-density urbanism is not a euphemism for sparsely populated. It denotes systems where populations are spread across wide territories in interlinked clusters rather than concentrated in a single vertical core. Such arrangements allow scale without skyscrapers, many medium-sized centers, each with public spaces linked by roads, rivers, and ritual networks. The political forms implied by this model are distributed and networked, involving negotiated leadership, seasonal coalition building, and shared labor, systems built to manage ecological complexity rather than to erect permanent monuments. The implications extend beyond demography to how we think about technological and ecological knowledge. The Amazonian record shows deliberate investments in soil, water, and species assemblages. Terra preta, repeatedly documented and studied, is a durable signature of landscape-scale agroecology. People engineered fertility that lasted centuries, enabling sustained yields and ecological resilience. Waterworks, canals, reservoirs, fish weirs demonstrate sophisticated hydrological thinking, controlling flood pulses, concentrating fish, and irrigating orchards. The mosaic of orchards and agroforestry argues for a metabolic relationship with biodiversity. Humans did not clear-cut ecosystems to impose monocultures. They curated species assemblages that provided diverse resources while preserving ecological function. This is a model of intensification that differs from old-world plow agriculture and provides lessons about sustainability and resilience.
Comparison to other early urban centers is useful, but must be careful. The Amazonian systems do not replicate the scale and monumentality of cities like Teotihuacan or Tenochtitlan, or the Nile's flood-fed metropolises. Instead, they offer an alternative template: cities as distributed nodes embedded in managed ecologies. Think of a networked city-state where plazas and gardens are as central as palaces and where hydrological engineering substitutes for monumental stone architecture. Measured by coordination, labor investment, and infrastructural sophistication, Amazonian centers share key attributes with recognized early complex societies: complexity of craft production, long-distance exchange, ritual institutionalization, and public works. They widen our definition of urbanity to include systems that optimized social life for forested, flood-prone environments. This intellectual reorientation provokes hard questions about the historiography of the Americas. Why did it take so long for these patterns to be recognized? The answers are multiple: methodological blind spots, a bias toward stone architecture, political neglect and marginalization of indigenous voices, and demographic silence left by epidemic. But technology alone does not solve interpretive problems. LiDAR tells us where to dig. Soil chemistry and radiocarbon dating tell us when. Ethnography tells us why. The best contemporary studies are multidisciplinary and collaborative,
integrating remote sensing, excavation, environmental science, and indigenous knowledge to reconstruct social systems with nuance and respect. The process of rediscovery, then, is also a process of epistemic repair, correcting the blind spots of earlier science and restoring complexity to regions long simplified in academic and public narratives. There are practical stakes to this reinterpretation beyond the academy. Legal and political claims about land rights, stewardship, and conservation can rest on historical facts. If regions of the Amazon were shaped by long-term indigenous management, then contemporary conservation strategies that exclude indigenous stewardship are not only ethically questionable, but also historically ignorant. Recognizing ancient landscape management strengthens arguments for collaborative conservation that centers indigenous practices and knowledge systems. In some places, archaeological findings have supported communities in reclaiming traditional territories or arguing for management rights, an intersection of history, law, and ecology with real-world consequences. The new discoveries also provoke ecological humility. Contemporary forest governance and restoration projects can learn from how people once curated biodiversity and stored fertility in soils. Terra preta, for example, has become a subject of interest for modern agronomists and climate scientists exploring biochar and carbon sequestration. But the translation from archaeological insight to applied policy must be done with humility and partnership. These are indigenous technologies embedded in social institutions, not recipes to be extracted without context. Moreover, the recognition that much of the Amazon is a cultural landscape challenges conservation models that imagine an untouched wilderness to be preserved by excluding people. Instead, stewardship approaches that support local management, recognize historical land uses, and invest in community-led conservation align better with both history and sustainability. Science continues to refine the chronologies and regional variation of Amazonian urbanism. Radiocarbon projects are extending timelines. Regional surveys are mapping variability. Some areas show intensive raised field systems and reservoir complexes, others ring ditches and geoglyphs, others still networks of plazas and causeways. This diversity matters. It tells us that human ingenuity found multiple strategies for thriving in different ecologies across the basin. There is no single Amazon city, but many urban experiments adapted to local hydrology, soils, and biological assemblages. The plurality of solutions enriches the story. The Amazon is a laboratory of human ecological innovation spanning millennia. Rediscovery is also an ethical challenge. New maps and papers bring attention, and sometimes exploitation, to vulnerable landscapes. LiDAR footprints and published site coordinates can be used by looters or developers. Collaborative protocols that involve local communities and restrict sensitive data are essential. Archaeologists and policymakers must balance the public value of knowledge with the responsibility to protect cultural heritage and living communities. This is part of the new practice, scholarship that not only produces knowledge, but also safeguards people and places. Ultimately, the story the data tell is not only about technical feats of mapping or monumental engineering. It is about human imagination and flexibility. People who refused to accept that their soils were destiny, who invented ways to hold fertility in black earth, to shape water into predictable resources, and to design cities that worked with the forest rather than against it. Rediscovering the Amazon's true past forces us to broaden our categories and to see human achievement where we once saw emptiness. It demands humility in science, partnership in practice, and wonder in the face of human adaptation. As we prepare to draw this history toward its reflective close, we will turn in the final part to what these lessons mean now, in an era of unprecedented deforestation and climate change. The ancient strategies of soil, water, and species management are not fossils, they are living possibilities. Their recovery is not merely historical correction, it is a repository of techniques and values that may help us imagine a different relationship with one of the planet's most vital ecosystems.
The Amazon has always been more than a forest. It has been a mirror,
reflecting what humanity chooses to see in nature and in itself. For centuries, outsiders looked into its green depths and saw only wilderness, a place beyond civilization, beyond history. But the forest was never empty. Beneath its roots, beneath its rivers, the earth still holds the fingerprints of people who mastered the art of coexistence long before we learned the word sustainability. Their legacy is not written in stone monuments or imperial decrees, but in living systems, in the quiet fertility of terra preta, in the symmetry of forgotten roads, in the orchard species that still bear fruit in the wild. These were people who understood that endurance does not come from domination, but from balance. They turned soil into technology, rivers into allies, and biodiversity into wealth. Their greatest monument was the forest itself, not conquered, but cultivated. When European diseases arrived, they silenced millions, and the canopy closed over the plazas and causeways, concealing the memory of what had been achieved here. Centuries later, explorers mistook that silence for emptiness. They could not imagine that the forest itself was the inheritance of civilization, that what looked like untouched wilderness was in fact a vast human garden slowly reclaiming its own design. Now, with satellites and lasers, we see what ancient eyes once saw without machines: networks of cities, orchards, canals, and homes, evidence that civilization does not require marble or empire, only understanding. The Amazon's ancient societies did not fight nature, they choreographed their lives to its rhythms. In doing so, they created a system more sophisticated, more sustainable, and more humane than many of the industrial models that replaced them. Their story is not a relic of the past, it is a message to the future. As we face deforestation, climate collapse, and the exhaustion of our own soils, the people beneath the Amazon offer a quiet lesson that true progress is not expansion, but harmony, not exploitation, but stewardship. Civilization is not measured by what it builds, but by what it preserves. When we speak of the Amazon today, the lungs of the earth, the cradle of biodiversity, we are also speaking of them. Their hands shaped this ecosystem, their knowledge sustained it, and their disappearance gave it back its silence. To rediscover their world is to rediscover possibility, the vision of a humanity capable of thriving within the limits of nature, not against them. Beneath the canopy, under centuries of soil and silence, the eternal garden still endures, a civilization woven into the living fabric of the forest, waiting for us to remember that we too were its gardeners.